I have some great news, and couldn't we use some great news tonight? Yeah. Bud Funk, I got some great news. My news is, you've probably been worrying about this, but there is in fact Toastmasters in heaven. Yay! The news gets better. They don't do table topics. Hell's chapter does table topics. Heaven's chapter only does prepared speeches, and they do icebreakers. And I've got a story about an icebreaker. This was a gentleman who recently passed away, a lifelong native of the Valley Park and Times Beach area. Passed away and went to heaven and met St. Peter and immediately joined the Toastmaster chapter. That's chapter number 1, by the way. And St. Peter said, "You're going to do an icebreaker." And the guy said, "What am I going to talk about?" And he said, "Well, talk about something you really know about, because you got a big audience with a lot of experience." And he said, "Well, I lived in Valley Park and Times Beach. There's one thing I know, it's floods. I'm going to talk about the floods of the 80s, because I'm an expert and I'll know more than anybody." And St. Peter said, "Well, that's good, but be careful, Noah is going to be in the audience." Now, I mentioned that because here I am talking about how you can better improve your presentations to an audience that already knows an awful lot about how to do that. We've got Tom Krauska, humorist extraordinaire in our audience. Howard Brandt, Valerie York, accomplished speakers everywhere, and I'm going to stand up here and tell you all about putting humor in your presentations. That's why, as you'll see as this workshop unfolds, a lot of the answers and a lot of the content will come from the experts in the audience. Now let's begin by talking about humor, and we're going to talk about how to use it and when to use it and ways to use it. And I am now going to ask Howard and Anita to pass out some work-along handouts, and you'll see that these have lots of blank spaces in them. And we're going to do some fill-ins, and we're going to get a lot of opinions and ideas from the assembled Toastmasters right here. Okay, does everybody have one? Okay, you don't need to turn the page yet. I'll tell you when to turn the page. I need to be in control of this. Now, who was reading ahead? JD was reading ahead. Tonight we're going to do the first half of this section. We'll stop somewhere around page 7 or 8, and then next week we'll finish it up, assuming you like the first week enough to show up next week. Now, a really good humorist by the name of Doc Blakely, one of the top speakers on the circuit, was asked in kind of a panel discussion of famous speakers, is it important to put humor in your presentations? Doc Blakely's response was, only if you want to get paid. And what that means is your audiences are expecting that. Everybody knows it's important to put humor in presentations. But let's turn that around. What are some reasons why you don't want to put humor in presentations? Why are you cautious about putting humor in presentations? I'm going to open that up to the floor and take whatever thoughts you have. What's stopping us from putting humor in presentations? Paul has a suggestion. Afraid that it won't work. What else? Bill has one.
Inappropriate timing.
Inappropriate at times. Mark has one.
Afraid of offending someone?
Could offend. Who can give me one more?
You're not real good at it.
The purpose of this workshop, which we'll finish next week, I think when this is all done, here's what I want to come out of this. You will not be afraid to use humor. We will hopefully be convinced that there are very few places that humor is not appropriate. We will talk about ways to avoid, to preclude offending any members in our audience. And we're going to be really good at this when this is all done. That is the objectives of this workshop, so that all of the reasons that are in the backs of our minds as to why not to use humor, we're going to be so convinced and good at using jokes. Every speech will be a humorous speech winner. Now you can turn to page 1. Here are 4 reasons, which are my reasons, but you can add some others, why I think you ought to use humor. First reason is it sells yourself. The audience is expecting to be entertained. When a speaker takes the platform, when a speaker takes the lectern, the audience sits back and makes some judgments. And they will be more apt to make good judgments about you if you entertain them. It's critical to a speaker. Nobody wants to listen to a bore, a dullard, or somebody that's depressing. They're in an audience because they want to have a good time. So it will sell yourself as a speaker, and it will sell your credentials. And secondly, because of that, it will sell your message. It will make your message, regardless of what it is, more palatable, more believable, more credible, because you've put humor in it. The third reason that you want to use humor is because it keeps interest. Even the best speaker, after a few minutes, that audience is going to doze off. They're going to zone somewhere else. You've probably heard the statistic that at any given moment, 2/3 of your audience is engaged in some sort of sexual fantasy while you're talking. Now, one of the ways that we can get some of those people back on track is to lace our presentation with humor. And finally, we increase retention. People remember your message, remember your jokes, if you use humor and use it appropriately. Now, see down there where it says the rule of thumb? This is what most speakers recommend, that you need about 1 joke every 7 minutes. Audience needs a little break. It's like a commercial. We need to stop the intensity about every 7 minutes and break it with some humor. So if you're going to do a 7-minute speech, you really ought to have 2, one at the beginning and at least 1 at the end. You can do more than that, by the way. But remember that 1-to-7 ratio. Now, we talked about, where don't you use humor? My opinion, there are precious few spots that you cannot use humor. I have heard speakers take the audience, of which I was a member of the audience, from the most somber of speeches, talking about their personal experiences and bouts with addiction and personal tragedies, and within moments go to a humorous story. And then, again, get back into things of intensity and seriousness, and then go back in humor. I don't think there are too many places that you can't use humor. I witnessed a fellow that is really gifted at humor, and he was addressing a group of bankers. Now, I don't say that to pick on people in this room that are bankers, but if we can allow ourselves to stereotype for a moment. Bankers, you may think, are not funny guys. And this group was not a bunch of funny guys. And the person that was leading the group, and these, by the way, were senior managers of bankers. And this speaker had a lot of jokes. And he was laying them out one after another, and they were going nowhere. And finally, he walked up to the most serious looking of the bankers, which would be someone that might look something like this, and he went, "Is that formaldehyde ice cream? Could we take your left shoe off and look for a tag?" And what happened was just what happened here. It broke the group. And of all people, the bankers laughed. Even the dead guy started to laugh. And I mention that because I've seen really very, very few cases where it's not appropriate. I think you ought to approach all your presentations with the idea of where can I put some humor in here and make that an objective, using the 1-to-7 formula. Okay, page 2, anatomy of a joke. And let me preface this by saying, Mark Twain, I think, commented on the dangers of dissecting jokes. Dissecting jokes, said, is like dissecting frogs. It's boring and the frog dies. But I think there's something to be learned, and I picked what I think is the most enduring and simplest joke ever created by Henny Youngman probably 50 years ago. Take my wife, please. People still laugh at that. Everybody's heard it thousands of times. Why does it still work? Here's the reason why, and this is the important ingredient of all jokes. All jokes are like a magic trick. And that's what this joke is. A magic trick does two things. It has a setup, and then it has a surprise. The first three words of this joke are the setup. Take my wife. And what you're immediately thinking is, oh, as an example. And then the surprise is please. Think about how that joke would work, or wouldn't work if we said the same point. Consider my wife, please. Now it's not funny anymore because there's no setup. There's no misdirection. But what I'm doing with a joke is misdirecting my audience, getting to look where the magic's not, and then I spring a surprise on them. All jokes have as that ingredient setup and surprise. Now here's one of the reasons that I mention this is because audiences resist magic tricks. Inherently, nobody likes to be fooled. When you watch a magician, what are you looking for? How'd he do that? I don't want to be fooled. I want to know how he did it. And so the important thing to remember when you select, adapt, and use humor is how am I going to fool the audience? How am I going to misdirect them? How am I going to do sleight of hand with my words? So the only thing we need to remember about what makes jokes work is that it's like a magic trick. It's got setup and surprise. We can turn the page again. In delivery, I wanted to make a couple of points. One has to do with emphasis and one is timing. I'm going to guess that Paul is a newlywed of how many years? 1.5 years. You know, he told me at an earlier meeting that, he was about to have a baby. This was not the first crisis of the marriage. This was not the first bit of trauma. In fact, the first bit of trauma happened within weeks after the marriage. And it was a subject that comes up a lot in marriages. It was boys' night out. He insisted she give it up. Okay, set up and surprise, but let's talk about the emphasis. The surprise was what line? He insisted she give it up. Where do I want to put the emphasis? She give it up. In other words, as you select what word to really pounce on, you need to remember where's the surprise, and that's the one you goose. Okay? She give it up. Okay, timing. Here are a few ideas on timing. And I'm going to speak in generalities. If you're too fast, the audience is going to miss it. But if you're too slow, which I think is the worst sin, the audience is going to guess where you're going. So I like to be fast in my delivery because I don't want to risk the audience figuring out what the surprise is. If I said, take my wife, and waited a long time, people would start to figure out where I was going with that. So I like to be kind of rapid with it. And on the subject of timing, here's the thing to remember about jokes. Jokes are like trees. They're about 90% air, and the most important part of timing in a joke is where you put the air. And this is a matter of practice, and fortunately we have a support group right here where we can practice our jokes and refine them to a fine, keen edge. Okay, next page, page 4. How to select humor. Here are my 4 rules, and I steal humor from all over the place, and I'm going to get to that on the next page, but here are my criteria. First off, the joke needs to be funny to you. I don't think you can tell jokes that you don't laugh at yourself. So as you look for things to glom onto, make sure it's funny to you. Here's an even more important test. The joke is funny on paper. Funny on paper. You don't have to hear a gifted comedian tell it to laugh. It's funny all by its lonesome. Third, it's easy to say. No big words, and that leads me into number 4. I would avoid dialogue, faces, accents, or anything like that. Lee Trevino gave the best advice on how to deliver jokes. He said, deliver them straight. If you have to rely on dramatics or clowning, that sort of thing, you are asking for trouble. Okay, my next page has to do with sources. Borrowing, quoting, personal experience, news, and ad-libs. I borrow a lot of my jokes from Tom Krauske. After I run out of my Tom Krauske jokes, and he has a lot of good ones, I read a lot of those joke books. You ever see those books, 10,000 Jokes? Let me tell you something. If you read 10,000 jokes, you'll find 10 good ones. That has been and so you have to invest a lot of time. But funny to you, funny on paper, that's where you get them. So have the patience to read through those. And when you find something that's funny, write it down and store it away, because then you'll be able to blend that into your speeches to make them more effective. I love to quote people. My two favorite are Woody Allen and Yogi Berra. They have never let me down. Woody Allen's great. One of the ones I've been using a lot is his analysis of organized crime. Organized crime grosses $40 billion a year and spends very little on office supplies. Yogi Berra, when I'm presenting statistics, this is my favorite, the Yogi Berra pizza story. When he ordered a pizza and they asked him if he wanted cut into 4 or into 8 sections, he said, "You better cut it into 4. I don't think I can eat 8. And what a great lead-in for a pie chart or some sort of statistics. You can't miss with Yogi Berra. Honest to God. Personal experience. I have 46 years of humorous things that have happened to me, and I'm not embarrassed to share them because they almost always get a laugh. The news. Jay Leno is making a career out of doing not much more than reading headlines. The world is so upside down, it's hard to miss with the news. And finally, ad-lib. Things that happen just before you go on, just before your presentation. Work, but don't count on them. Make sure you have an arsenal of number 1 through 4. Okay, the last page that we're going to talk about tonight. Mark, are we really at 15 minutes? Ooh, God, I was having so much fun. All right, I'm going to do 2 more pages. We're doing okay. All jokes need targets. You have to make fun of something. And here are what I think are the best ones and the worst ones. The best target you have is yourself. You know, when we talked over here, you could offend somebody. You won't offend anybody if you're making fun of yourself. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but Tom Krauske likes to make fun of me. Now, I let him do that. And Tom Krauske, for reasons that I don't quite understand, feels that I dress a bit on the conservative side. So I fooled him and wore this particularly flashy tie tonight. And I chose this shirt just for tonight. Tom is in the minority. My son, when he was in high school, came to me one morning as he was getting ready to go to school and said, "Dad, I want to borrow one of your suits." I said, "Really?" I said, "Is this a career day at school?" And he said, No. I said, "Well, do you have, a job interview?" And he said, No, actually, it's nerd day. Now, I got to confess, I stole that joke. That was Carl's joke. But it always works. It's easy to make fun of yourself. Audience will always laugh with you. Okay, the next best target is superiority figures. Politicians are real good. Presidents are real good. Presidents of our club are good. Elders of our club are particularly good. Next good subject, the common enemy, and not necessarily a big enemy. Lawyers are real good. On occasion, postal employees are pretty good. Donald Trump, Leona Helmsley, they're great. You can't miss. Can't miss. Who would begrudge you a joke on them? Mother-in-laws, I think, are pretty good. Usually works. I have a little personal problem with that. I actually like my mother-in-law, and one of the favorite things I like to do is take her for a drive to the airport. Set up and surprise. Youth is usually pretty good if you don't have a lot of kids in the audience. Okay, what are the worst targets? Inferiority figures, the opposite of superiority figures. Don't pick on little guys. The audience itself is high risk. I mentioned several months ago that I did a presentation to the attorneys of Bryan Cave. And I said that I didn't do any lawyer jokes, which is true. But in my presentation, I did mention that there was such a thing as lawyer jokes, which they found very unfunny. Very unfunny, high risk. I think that animals by themselves are unfunny. High risk, particularly anymore, doing anything that's ethnic and anything with women, just not good anymore. Just not good anymore. Okay, this is the last page we're going to do. I'm a zillion minutes over. Once you have the target, you choose the ammunition. And there are three criteria, three things to think about: the strength, the sophistication, and the length. The strength, how hard are you going to hit the targets? And what that means is you pick the poke, how hard you're going to hit that target based on what that target is. You can take a pretty good shot at Leona Helmsley. I would take a much softer shot if I were going to make fun of the founder of our club, Howard Grant. Always err on, by the way, being soft. Never be really, really cruel to anybody, anything. Sophistication. How sophisticated is your audience? And my advice here is never overestimate that. Always try to be less sophisticated than the audience in your use of humor. And finally, length. Short is better. If you have a long story, that baby better be good. Because the longer that story goes on, the bigger the punchline the audience is expecting. You can get away with one-liners that aren't too funny, but if you got a long setup, you better be really sure that that baby works and works every time. Okay, my final avoids: off-color, drug and alcohol jokes, character references, gay jokes, all that stuff. It's not worth the risk. Remember we said here, could offend. Those are the kinds of things that can offend, and you don't need them. There are too many other easy people to make fun of, including yourself. And those are the things that work the best. Okay, next week we're going to talk about the most important part, so that's why I want you to come back next week, how to take your jokes and make a point with them. Most important part of the whole presentation. Mr. Toastmaster and audience, thank you very much.
Thank you.